My beloved child. There are some words a person can hear only once and remember for the rest of their life. Not because the words were loud. Not because they were cruel. But because they came from the mouth of the one person whose voice had once made the world feel safe. You had heard their voice in ordinary moments before. Half-awake conversations. Quiet laughter. Small disagreements that neither of you remembered by the next morning. The soft way they used to say your name when they wanted your attention without asking for it. You knew the difference between their tired voice and their irritated voice. You knew when they were pretending to be fine. You knew the little pause they made before admitting something difficult. And perhaps that is why the sentence stayed with you. I never thought I'd have to say this to you. There was something about those words that made your heart understand the seriousness of the moment before your mind could. You remember the silence that followed. You remember looking at them and waiting. Not knowing whether you were about to hear an apology, a confession, a goodbye, or something that would change the way you understood everything that had happened between you. They looked away. That small movement hurt more than you expected. Because there was a time when this person could look directly into your eyes and tell you anything. Now they seem to need distance even while standing only a few steps away. And perhaps you wondered afterward whether that was the moment you lost them. But my beloved child, that is not where this story truly began. It began much earlier. It began in all the things neither of you said when saying them might still have changed something. You had loved each other in a way that did not always look romantic from the outside. Sometimes love was simply remembering how the other person took their coffee. Sometimes it was knowing they had a difficult day without being told. Sometimes it was sitting beside each other without speaking because neither of you needed to fill the silence. There had been a strange familiarity between you. Not perfection. Not some effortless story where everything happened at exactly the right moment. There were misunderstandings. There were moments when pride entered rooms before either of you did. There were conversations that ended too early. There were apologies that arrived after the wound had already hardened. And there were things you both assumed the other person understood without ever actually saying them. That was where the trouble began. You thought love could be felt without being explained. They thought love could survive without being protected. Both of you were partly right. And both of you were wrong. Because love can be real and still be mishandled. A person can care deeply and still make choices that hurt someone. Two people can mean everything to each other and still become strangers for a while because neither knows how to cross the distance they created. You remember one particular evening when you first sensed that something had changed. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the strange part. There was no argument. No betrayal. No door slammed shut. They simply became quieter. At first, you told yourself they were tired. Then you thought perhaps they were overwhelmed. Then you wondered whether something had happened in their life that they did not know how to explain. You asked once. They smiled and said, "I'm fine." You accepted the answer. Perhaps because you wanted it to be true. Perhaps because some part of you already feared the alternative. After that, the silence became a habit. Messages became shorter. Conversations became practical. The warmth was still there sometimes, but it appeared in strange places, like sunlight reaching a room through a curtain that had almost completely closed. You noticed. Of course you noticed. You simply did not know what to do with what you noticed. So you did what people often do when they are afraid of losing something. You tried harder. You became more careful. You replayed conversations in your mind. You wondered whether you had asked for too much. Whether you had become too emotional. Whether your needs had somehow become a burden. Whether giving them more space would bring them closer. And the more uncertain you became, the more you searched their behavior for answers. A delayed message became a question. A quiet conversation became a warning. A change in tone became something you analyzed long after the conversation ended. You were no longer simply living inside the relationship. You were studying it. That is a lonely way to love someone. Because when you spend every moment trying to determine whether someone still wants you, you stop noticing how exhausted you have become from trying to be wanted. They noticed the change in you too. But they misunderstood it. They thought you were becoming distant. You thought they were becoming distant. Both of you were standing on opposite sides of the same silence, waiting for the other person to cross it. Neither moved. Until one day, something happened that neither of you had planned. You found an old photograph. It was not particularly beautiful. The lighting was imperfect. One of you was laughing with your eyes closed. The other was looking away from the camera. There was nothing extraordinary about the picture. And yet you remembered exactly what had happened that day. You remembered the conversation. You remembered the foolish joke that made them laugh. You remembered how, afterward, they had said something you did not understand at the time. You make ordinary days feel different. You had smiled then. You thought it was simply a sweet thing to say. Years later, you realized how much that sentence had meant. Because some people do not understand what they have while they are standing inside it. They only recognize its shape after they have stepped away. And perhaps that was beginning to happen to them. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. They began remembering you in places where you were no longer present. A familiar song would bring back your voice. A certain kind of evening would remind them of conversations that once seemed insignificant. They would reach for their phone to tell you something and stop halfway through. They would see something you would have laughed at and instinctively think of sending it to you. Then they would remember. You were no longer the person they could simply message whenever they wanted. And that realization carried a strange weight. Because absence does something that presence cannot. Presence can become familiar. Absence forces memory to speak. At first, they resisted it. They told themselves they were only nostalgic. They told themselves that missing someone did not mean they should return. They told themselves that people move on. They repeated these things because they were easier than asking the more frightening question. Why had they let someone they loved become someone they could lose? That question followed them. Not every hour. Not every day. But often enough. And eventually they began remembering something else. The night you had tried to tell them that you were hurting. You had not asked them to fix everything. You had not demanded an answer. You had simply wanted them to understand. But they had been tired. Defensive. Preoccupied with their own fears. They had listened without really hearing you. Then they said something that stayed with you. Maybe you're expecting too much from me. You did not answer immediately. You remember the feeling. It was not anger. It was something quieter. The sudden realization that the person you wanted comfort from had become the person you needed comfort from because they had hurt you. You said, "I don't need everything. I just need to know that you care." They looked away. And that was the moment something inside you became smaller. Not because you stopped loving them. Because you stopped feeling safe enough to show how much you did. They remembered that conversation later. And when they did, the memory did not flatter them. For the first time, they understood that your silence afterward had not been punishment. It had been exhaustion. You had not become cold. You had become careful. There is a difference. A cold heart does not care. A careful heart often cares so much that it is afraid of being wounded again. They began to understand this slowly. And understanding did not make them feel better. It made them uncomfortable. Because once you recognize the damage you caused, you can no longer hide behind the excuse that you did not know. So they began asking themselves questions. Why had they pulled away? Why had they made affection feel uncertain? Why had they treated vulnerability like pressure? Why had they assumed you would always remain available? And underneath all those questions was another one. Was it possible that they had confused being loved with being entitled to someone's patience? That question frightened them. Because if the answer was yes, then losing you had not simply been bad luck. Some of it had been their choice. Meanwhile, you were learning something of your own. You were learning how to stop waiting for explanations that might never come. It did not happen overnight. Healing rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it begins with something painfully ordinary. You stop checking. You stop rereading. You stop imagining what they might be doing. You wake up one morning and realize that several hours have passed without you wondering whether they thought about you. Then you notice it. The quiet. Not the empty quiet that once frightened you. A different kind. A quiet that belongs to you. You began filling your days again. Not because you stopped caring. Because you finally understood that caring about someone did not require abandoning yourself. You became less interested in proving what you had meant to them. You became more interested in understanding what the relationship had meant to you. And that question took you somewhere deeper. You realized you had spent so much time wondering whether they were your soulmate that you had forgotten to ask whether the relationship allowed you to remain yourself. Perhaps that is one of the hardest truths love can teach. A deep connection is not automatically a healthy connection. A powerful bond does not excuse repeated hurt. And missing someone does not mean you must return to the version of yourself you became while trying to keep them. You began to see that what was meant for you would not require you to disappear in order to preserve it. That realization did not make the memories meaningless. If anything, it made them more honest. You could remember the good without denying the pain. You could admit that you loved them without pretending everything they did was acceptable. You could wish them well without placing your life on pause. And somewhere in that process, something changed in you. They felt it. People sometimes notice when they no longer occupy the same place in someone's heart. Not because love has necessarily disappeared. Because dependence has. You were no longer waiting at the same emotional door. And when they realized that, fear entered the place where certainty had once lived. They had assumed you would always be there. Then suddenly they were not sure. They considered reaching out. More than once. They wrote messages. Deleted them. Wrote another. Deleted that one too. One message began with your name. Another began with, "I don't know if I should be saying this." A third was nothing more than a question. "Do you ever think about us?" They stared at it for a long time. Then they deleted it. Because they knew the question was not really about you. It was about whether they still had a place in your heart. And they were afraid of discovering that they did not. Eventually, they spoke to someone they trusted. The conversation was not dramatic. There were no grand revelations. Just one uncomfortable sentence. You know, you might have lost them because you kept assuming they'd stay. They became defensive. I never wanted to lose them. The answer came quietly. That isn't the same as knowing how to keep someone. Those words stayed with them. Because love is not only about intention. Sometimes the hardest lesson is discovering that what you meant and what the other person experienced can be completely different. You may have meant to protect yourself. They may have experienced rejection. You may have meant to give space. They may have experienced abandonment. You may have been afraid of becoming dependent. They may have believed you did not care. Two people can live through the same relationship and carry entirely different stories afterward. And slowly, they began seeing yours. Not because you explained it. Because you stopped explaining. Your absence became the evidence. One day, they returned to a place connected to one of your memories. They had not gone there intentionally. That was what made it harder. Something in the ordinary surroundings brought you back. They remembered you sitting nearby. They remembered the way you used to notice small things. They remembered how you would sometimes become quiet when something mattered deeply to you. And then they remembered something they had forgotten. You had once asked them a simple question. What are you afraid of? They had laughed. They had avoided answering. You had smiled and said, "You don't have to tell me." They thought about that now. And suddenly they understood. You had not been asking because you wanted information. You had been asking because you wanted to know them. There had been so many moments when you had tried to enter their inner world. They had mistaken intimacy for pressure. That realization hurt. But it also changed something. For the first time, they were no longer thinking only about how much they missed you. They were thinking about the person they had been when they were with you. And that was much more difficult. Because missing you was easy. Taking responsibility was not. They began remembering their own fears. The parts of themselves they had hidden. The ways they had learned long ago to leave before someone could leave them. The instinct to become distant whenever something became too important. They had always called it independence. Perhaps some of it had been fear. You had not created that fear. But you had become close enough to touch it. And instead of confronting it, they had pushed you away. That was the truth they had been avoiding. You had not been asking for perfection. You had been asking for presence. And they had not known how to give it. Meanwhile, you had reached a point where you no longer needed them to understand all of this for your healing to continue. That was important. Because sometimes we secretly make our healing dependent on someone else's realization. We imagine that one day they will finally understand everything. They will apologize perfectly. They will explain every silence. They will admit exactly what they did. And when that happens, we think the past will finally become peaceful. But my beloved child, peace cannot always wait for another person's confession. Sometimes you have to stop requiring someone else to understand your pain before you allow yourself to stop carrying it. You began doing that. Not perfectly. There were still nights when memory returned. There were still moments when you wondered. There were still questions with no answer. But the questions no longer controlled you. And that was when they finally reached the point they had been avoiding. They decided to contact you. Not with a dramatic declaration. Not with a promise. Not with the kind of message designed to pull you back emotionally. They simply asked if you would be willing to talk. You stared at the message. For a moment, the old version of you appeared. The one who would have answered immediately. The one who would have searched the message for hidden meaning. The one who would have wondered whether this was the beginning of your return to each other. But you were not that person anymore. So you waited until your heart was calm. Then you answered. Yes. We can talk. When the conversation finally happened, neither of you knew where to begin. They looked different to you. Not physically. Something in their expression had changed. There was less certainty. More honesty. They took a breath. I don't know how to say this. You remained quiet. They looked at you. And then came the words you had never expected to hear from them. I never thought I'd have to say this to you. They stopped. Your heart tightened. I thought you would always understand me, they continued. I thought because you loved me, I wouldn't have to explain why I pulled away. I thought you'd know I was scared. I thought you'd know I didn't mean to hurt you. You said nothing. They swallowed. But I realize now that asking you to understand what I refused to explain wasn't fair. There was no dramatic music. No perfect moment. No sudden restoration of everything that had been broken. Just two people sitting with the consequences of choices they could not undo. They continued. I kept thinking the problem was that you needed too much from me. Their voice became quieter. Now I think I was afraid that if I gave you everything you were asking for, you'd become important enough to hurt me. You looked at them. And for the first time, they did not look away. That doesn't excuse what I did, they said. No, you answered. It was a simple word. But it was honest. They nodded. I know. That may have been the first truly healthy conversation the two of you had ever had. Because there was no attempt to win. No attempt to make the other person feel guilty. No attempt to turn pain into a competition. Just truth. You told them what their silence had done to you. They listened. Really listened. There were moments when their face changed because something you said was difficult to hear. But they did not defend themselves, they did not interrupt. They did not say, "That's not what I meant." They simply said, "I understand why you felt that way." And perhaps that sentence was more meaningful than any romantic declaration could have been. Because for once, they were not asking you to reinterpret your own experience to make them feel better. Then they said something you did not expect. I don't know if you should take me back. You looked at them. They continued. I want another chance. But wanting one doesn't mean I deserve one. Something inside you became still. Because once upon a time, you had needed them to fight for you. Now you were listening to someone finally understand that love was not ownership. You said, I don't know either. They nodded. And somehow, that answer did not feel like rejection. It felt like honesty. You both had spent so long believing that love meant finding the perfect answer. Maybe it meant being brave enough to admit when you did not have one. They asked whether you were happy. You hesitated. Then you said, I'm learning to be. They smiled sadly. I think that's what scares me. What? That you learned how to be okay without me. You looked down. I was never supposed to need you in order to be okay. They were quiet. Then they said, I know. And perhaps that was the moment the relationship changed. Not because you reunited. Not because everything was forgiven. Because the love between you finally became less about possession and more about truth. They did not ask you to promise anything. You did not ask them to promise anything. Instead, they began doing something neither of you had done enough before. They showed up consistently. Not dramatically. Consistently. They asked how you were and listened to the answer. They communicated when something frightened them instead of disappearing. They admitted when they were wrong. They stopped treating vulnerability like weakness. And you learned something too. You learned that forgiveness did not mean pretending the wound had never existed. You could forgive someone and still require different behavior. You could love someone and still move slowly. You could believe in the possibility of reconciliation without forcing yourself to trust before trust had been rebuilt. That distinction mattered. Because you were no longer trying to recreate the relationship you had lost. You were asking whether something healthier could grow from what remained. And that takes time. There were still difficult moments. Old patterns do not disappear simply because two people finally understand them. One evening, they became quiet again. You felt the old fear rise. For a moment, you were back in that earlier version of your life. The delayed answer. The distance. The uncertainty. Your mind began creating explanations. But this time, you did something different. You asked, "Are you pulling away from me?" They looked at you. The old version of them might have said, "I'm fine." Instead, they took a breath. "I almost did." Your heart sank. Then they continued. "Something scared me. My instinct was to disappear. But I remembered what we talked about." They paused. "So I'm telling you instead." You nodded. It was such a small thing. Yet it felt enormous. Because sometimes transformation does not look like a person becoming completely different. Sometimes it looks like the same person reaching the same difficult moment and making a different choice. That was how trust returned. Not through promises. Through repetition. Through small evidence. Through moments that would have once ended badly but now ended with honesty. And perhaps this is what you needed to understand all along. The deepest connections are not always the ones that never break. Sometimes they are the ones that force two people to confront the parts of themselves they would rather avoid. But that does not mean every broken relationship must be restored. Some people return only long enough to teach you what you should never accept again. Some return because they have genuinely changed. Some return because they are lonely. Some return because they finally understand your value. And some return because they are ready to love you differently. Only time reveals which one is true. That is why you no longer need to chase the answer. You can watch. You can listen. You can pay attention to what happens after the apology. Because words can open a door. Only consistent action can prove someone is willing to walk through it. And your soulmate, if this person truly is meant to walk beside you, will not merely speak beautiful words when they are afraid of losing you. They will learn how to speak difficult truths before loss becomes inevitable. They will learn that loving you means knowing you are a whole person, not a possession. They will understand that your heart is not a waiting room where they can disappear and return whenever they become lonely. And you will understand something equally important. You do not have to become smaller to make love easier for someone else. You do not have to silence your needs to appear easy to love. You do not have to keep proving your loyalty by tolerating uncertainty forever. Real love should leave room for truth. There may still be a future between you. There may be another chapter neither of you can see yet. Or perhaps this story has already given you what it needed to give. Perhaps the person you thought was your final destination was actually part of the road that taught you how to come home to yourself. You do not need to know tonight. You do not need to force the ending. Let time reveal what words cannot. Let actions reveal what promises cannot. Let peace become louder than fear. And if they come toward you again, do not listen only to what they say. Listen to what has changed. Notice whether they can stay when conversations become uncomfortable. Notice whether they can apologize without immediately asking to be forgiven. Notice whether they respect the boundaries that once frightened them. Notice whether you feel safe enough to be honest. And most importantly, notice who you become when you are with them. Do you become anxious? Do you become smaller? Do you spend your days trying to earn reassurance? Or can you breathe? Can you speak? Can you disagree without fearing abandonment? Can you be imperfect without wondering whether love will disappear? These questions matter. Because perhaps the greatest sign of a soulmate is not that they make your heart race. Perhaps it is that, over time, their presence gives your heart permission to rest. And if this person is truly meant to remain in your life, they will not ask you to return to the version of yourself that waited endlessly for them to choose you. They will meet the version of you that finally chose yourself. That may be the only way the two of you can begin again. Not as the people who once loved each other and wounded each other, but as two people who finally understand what love requires. There is something else you should know. The sentence they once feared saying to you may not have been the sentence you thought it was. I never thought I'd have to say this to you. You may have believed the next words would be goodbye. Perhaps they once thought so too. But sometimes a goodbye is not the only thing hidden inside a sentence like that. Sometimes what follows is an admission. I was wrong. Sometimes it is courage. I was afraid. Sometimes it is grief. I didn't understand what I was losing. Sometimes it is love stripped of pride. I still care about you. And sometimes it is something even harder. I don't know if you can trust me again, but I finally understand why. That is where the story becomes yours. Because you are no longer the person who needs someone to return simply to prove that you were worth returning to. You know your worth now. You know that being missed is not the same as being loved correctly. You know that regret is not the same as transformation. You know that chemistry is not the same as safety. And you know that forgiveness is not a contract requiring you to reopen every door. If they come back, let them come back with truth. If they stay, let them stay with consistency. If they leave, let them leave without taking your peace with them. And if somewhere in the quiet, you still feel that there is something unfinished between you, you do not have to be ashamed of that. Some stories take time to understand. Some hearts need distance before they can recognize what closeness was trying to teach them. Some people need to lose access to you before they finally understand the privilege of having you. But do not turn that possibility into a prison. Keep living. Keep becoming. Keep allowing your heart to grow beyond the chapter that once broke it. Because the love that is meant to remain will not require you to stop living while you wait for it. And perhaps, one day, you will sit across from this person again. Maybe they will look at you with the same expression they wore when they first realized what they had done. Maybe there will still be uncertainty. Maybe neither of you will know exactly what comes next. But this time, there will be no need for games. No hidden messages. No deliberate silence. No pretending not to care. They may reach for your hand. And you may let them. Not because you are afraid of losing them. Because you are no longer afraid of losing yourself. That is the difference. That is what all the distance was trying to teach you. Love is not proven by how much pain you can survive for someone. It is revealed by what two people are willing to change so that neither has to keep surviving the relationship. And if this person truly belongs in your future, they will understand that. They will not simply tell you that they missed you. They will show you that they have learned from your absence. They will not simply say they regret losing you. They will become someone who knows how not to lose you in the same way again. And if they cannot do that, then perhaps their return was never meant to be your destination. Perhaps it was only meant to close the door on the version of love that taught you to confuse waiting with devotion. My beloved child, there are moments when God does not give you an immediate answer because the answer is still becoming visible through people's choices. You do not have to force certainty. You do not have to predict the future. You do not have to decide tonight whether this person is your forever. For now, let the truth be enough. You loved. You were hurt. You learned. They had their own fears. They made their own mistakes. And somewhere between losing each other and finding yourselves again, something changed. Maybe the two of you will build something new. Maybe you will walk separate roads. But either way, you are not leaving this story empty-handed. You are leaving with a deeper understanding of yourself. And that matters. Because the right love will never require you to betray the person you are becoming. So if their voice ever trembles again and they say those words, "I never thought I'd have to say this to you," do not rush to fill the silence. Let them speak. Let them tell the truth they once avoided. And then, my beloved child, listen not only with the heart that once loved them. Listen with the heart that learned how to love itself too. Because whatever comes next, you are no longer standing at the old door, waiting for someone else to decide whether you deserve to enter. You have already stepped into your own life. And if they are meant to walk beside you, they will not ask you to leave it behind. They will meet you there. Not as the person who once took your love for granted. Not as the person who expected you to wait forever. But as someone who finally understands what stood in front of them all along. And perhaps that is why the sentence that once sounded like the beginning of an ending can become something else entirely. A confession. A reckoning. A beginning. Not the beginning of the old story. That story has already happened. But the beginning of whatever can exist when two people finally stop hiding from the truth. And if that new beginning comes, let it be quiet. Let it be honest. Let it be earned. Let it unfold slowly enough that your heart can recognize the difference between being wanted and being truly cherished. You have waited long enough for words. Now let actions speak. You have carried enough uncertainty. Now let peace have a voice. You have spent enough time wondering whether someone would choose you. Now remember that you are allowed to choose too. And perhaps, somewhere beyond what you can see tonight, the person who once feared losing you is learning the same lesson. That love is not something we keep by holding tighter. It is something we protect by becoming honest enough to hold it properly. So breathe. Let the past remain where it belongs. Not erased. Not denied. Simply understood. The memory can stay without controlling you. The love can have been real without determining your future. The person can have mattered without becoming the measure of your worth. And whatever happens next, do not be afraid of the truth. If they return changed, you will know. If they return unchanged, you will know that too. If they never return, you will survive the silence. Because the person you were before all of this was searching for someone to choose them. The person you are becoming has learned something far more precious. You can love deeply without abandoning yourself. You can forgive without forgetting. You can hope without waiting helplessly. And you can let someone go without believing that losing them means losing the possibility of love. That is why you do not need to fear the sentence anymore. I never thought I'd have to say this to you. Perhaps once, those words would have shattered you. Now they can simply open a door. And whatever stands on the other side, you will meet it with a heart that has known heartbreak and still remained capable of love. A heart that has known silence and still learned to speak. A heart that has been disappointed and still refused to become bitter. A heart that finally understands that being someone's soulmate, if that is what this connection truly is, does not mean being their emotional prisoner. It means meeting each other freely. Honestly. Without games. Without fear disguised as distance. Without love being used as a reason to tolerate what continually wounds you. And perhaps that is the real answer you were searching for. Not whether they will come back. Not whether they still think about you. Not whether they regret what happened. But whether, when the moment finally arrives, both of you are capable of loving each other in a way that no longer requires either heart to disappear. If the answer is yes, there may be a beautiful road ahead. If the answer is no, then there is still a beautiful road ahead. Because your life was never meant to end at the place where someone failed to love you correctly. There is more beyond that room. More beyond that silence. More beyond the message you never received. More beyond the person you thought you could not live without. And perhaps one day, when you look back, you will realize that the hardest part was never losing them. The hardest part was learning that you could lose someone you loved and still find your way back to yourself. And once you did, something inside you became impossible to take away. Your peace. Your voice. Your dignity. Your ability to love without begging. Your ability to hope without chasing. Your ability to remember without returning to pain. So let the story unfold. Do not force the ending. Do not rewrite the past to make the future easier. Let what is real prove itself. And if someday they stand before you again, carrying all the words they were once too afraid to say, remember the person you became while they were gone. Remember how difficult it was to rebuild your quiet. Remember how long it took to stop questioning your worth. Remember that love may be worth another chance, but your peace is worth protecting. Then choose from that place. Not from fear. Not from loneliness. Not from nostalgia. From truth. Because the most beautiful ending may not be that the person who left finally comes back. It may be that when they do, you are no longer waiting for them to complete you. You are already whole. And if they truly are meant to walk beside you, they will not come back to finish the life you could not live without them. They will come back ready to share the life you learned to live beautifully on your own. And that, my beloved child, is a love worth recognizing. Not because it promises that no one will ever hurt you again, but because both hearts have finally learned what to do when fear appears. Stay. Speak. Listen. Tell the truth. And choose each other freely. That is how some endings become beginnings. Not with a perfect promise. Not with a dramatic return. But with two people finally brave enough to stop hiding. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet between what was and what may still be, that is what your heart has been waiting to hear all along. Not that someone cannot live without you. Not that someone is destined to return. But that real love, when it is given another chance, should never ask you to lose yourself again.